And with that, let's now shift focus over to the conflict in Sudan. It's day 4 and Sudan continues to witness the conflict between Sudanese armed forces and the rival paramilitary rapid support forces. Now, the conflict is affecting the ordinary citizen as well. The bustling markets in Sudan's capital city of Khartoum are now nearly deserted and is now seeing food prices surging, followed by shortage of essentials. Of course, that's nothing new to Sudan. As the deadly fighting between two rival military factions has entered the 4th day, Sudan is on the brink and the civilians are bearing the maximum brunt. Clashes that erupted in the country last Saturday killed at least 270 people and wounded another 2,600 as of Tuesday. As the conflict rages on, the people of Sudan are stuck between the devil and the deep sea when it comes to choosing between the two warring military factions.
This is the sound of a 24-hour ceasefire in Sudan being shattered, just minutes after it came into effect. The truce, agreed by the country's warring generals under US pressure, was intended to provide some respite to civilians now living under the shadow of warplanes. Instead, shortly after it was due to take hold at 6 p.m. local time on Tuesday, tank fire and loud shooting could be heard in Khartoum. Several witnesses reported a large ground army entering the capital from the east.
We have not had any confirmation or indication that this is holding.
At a briefing shortly after the deadline, UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric described fighting in Khartoum with jets, heavy artillery and small arms.
It is creating a climate that is extremely dangerous for civilians and by definition for our staff, humanitarian staff, diplomatic staff, and that's why we continue to engage with the parties in order to try to get a solid cessation of hostilities.
On Tuesday, the UN's aid chief said they were receiving reports of attacks and sexual violence against aid workers. The World Food Programme suspended operations after 3 of its employees were killed. The violence erupted on Saturday out of a power struggle between Sudan's military leader and his deputy. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan heads a ruling council installed after a 2021 military coup and the 2019 ouster of longtime autocratic leader Omar al-Bashir. General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti, is his number 2 and also leads the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Both sides, the army and the RSF, issued statements accusing each other of failing to respect the ceasefire. The fighting has derailed a transition to civilian rule and triggered what the UN described as a humanitarian catastrophe, including the near collapse of the health system. At least 185 people have been killed and many more injured.
So what's the situation on the ground level? Let's try and get you a bird's eye view of what's happening in Sudan. And for that, I'm joined in by Mohammed Usman Adam, who's a senior journalist joining me live from Khartoum. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for joining in. The epicenter of fighting remains Khartoum. What's the situation on ground zero?
Actually, the situation in Sudan is a little bit precarious. According to official statements and the statements coming from the paramilitary forces, the rapid support forces, and the Sudanese armed forces, the situation seems to be a little bit confusing. Each side will be telling you that they are in control of the situation. However, from what we could see on the ground, I think the army has the upper hand right now. But from the point of view of the public, the situation is a little bit difficult because you have services that have now been hugely impacted by the conflict. Economic activities have been stopped. Health services have been damaged. Actually, about 14 hospitals, almost 1/3 of the hospitals around Khartoum have been totally gotten out of service. And besides that, people will wake up in the morning on the sound of planes going to bombard position of the armed rebel forces, and people are told to stay inside their homes. Nobody is allowed to go around because we have so many people, according to eyewitnesses and according to footage that we have been receiving, who were killed. And we have huge number, even according to the Ministry of Health of Khartoum State, we have huge number of corpses in the street of Khartoum. So I think besides Khartoum being the center of the fighting, I think there is fighting still going on in other regions of the country. But on these regions of the state, we call them here, the army had the upper hand. A number of units belonging to the rapid support forces have been surrendered, and I think the army outside Khartoum has an upper hand. But around Khartoum itself, there are two areas where very sensitive areas, of course: the Republican Palace and the army headquarters. These are areas which have yet to be cleared up by the army.
Right. Mohammed, I'm going to request you to continue to stay with me, because it's important to, in fact, bring people to the reality of Sudan and how it is going to impact the entire world. So Sudan is witnessing an internal conflict, but its impact will be felt across the globe. What is at stake for other nations? Let's break it down for you in our next report.
The world is watching as a deadly power struggle unfolds between rival military factions in Sudan.
I strongly condemn the outbreak of fighting that is taking place in Sudan.
It's a fragile situation.
The country is in a strategic location, bordering the Red Sea, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa. And the conflict could destabilize an already volatile region. Here's what's at stake for international actors in the crisis. The White House has called for an immediate ceasefire to the fighting. Western powers, including the U.S., had swung behind a transition towards democratic elections following the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019. After a military coup in 2021, they suspended financial support and backed a plan for a new transition and a civilian government.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Western powers also fear the potential for a Russian base on the Red Sea, which Sudanese military leaders have expressed openness to. An agreement to host a base was originally reached under Bashir, and military leaders have said it remains under review. Moscow has long sought warm water ports for its navy, and in 2020, President Vladimir Putin said he approved a proposal to set up a logistics hub in Sudan. One of the key players in the current conflict, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemedti, visited Russia earlier this year and said Sudan had no problem with countries opening bases so long as they don't pose a threat to national security. Along with Russia, Hemedti has struck up relations with other powers such as the United Arab Emirates. It, along with fellow energy-rich power Saudi Arabia, has sought to shape events in Sudan. They see the transition away from Bashir's rule as a way to roll back Islamist influence and bolster stability in the region, along with the US and Britain. Meanwhile, change-averse Egypt is the most important backer of Sudan's armed forces and Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, another key player in the current conflict. Calls for a ceasefire and a return to talks are looking bleak. The possibility of protracted fighting increases the risk for civil war and complicates an already long-running economic crisis, as well as humanitarian needs in Sudan.
Mohammed, if I could come back to you, what will continued fighting mean for Sudan, and why is the UN mediation failing to enforce a ceasefire?
History of the country being put in a list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the economic embargo which Sudan was suffering from, and before just taking off after the fall of the regime of Omar al-Bashir, the country went into a very long 4 years of political debate without reaching a very specific agreement that would take off the economy, given the huge natural resources of the country. Now, this situation has created a further devastating situation for the country. If it continues, God forgive, I think it will have a very serious impact on Sudan. Now, one would wonder why the international community and the Western powers and the United Nations have not been able to impose, or at least to lead the two sides into observing a cessation of hostilities, then ceasefire, then sit for talks. Simply, I think I would say that because they don't have that leverage.
All right, Mohammed, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Many thanks for joining in. Stay safe.